Hello, welcome to our live stream. Once again, I forgot to turn the camera on. So hi there. Please hit the thumbs up. Please put a question in your chat. I did get several of your questions regarding what will be the outcome of Elizabeth Holmes' appeal. So I, like some of you, read through her 132-page appeal. So this video, this live stream, and thank you again for joining me, is going to be the highlights of her appeal. Why is Elizabeth Holmes appealing her convictions? She was convicted on 4 counts of wire fraud. 1, conspiring with Sunny Balwani, the former COO of Theranos, a blood testing company that Elizabeth Holmes started. And 3 counts she was convicted regarding defrauding individual investors. So we're going to talk about that. I'm going to give you the highlights. So again, thank you for joining me. Thanks for joining the live stream. And I did get several of your questions. I'll go through that. So let me tell you what we're going to do in this live stream. I'm going to talk to you about why she's appealing. I'm going to talk to you about the potential outcome of her appeal. Does she have other avenues to appeal? What's the next steps going to be? And I'm going to address your questions, and I'm going to follow you in the chat. So, hi there, I'm Michele Hagan. I'm a legal analyst and an attorney. I watched the Elizabeth Holmes trial. I was in the courtroom. So when I was reading through this appeal, I was remembering quite a bit of the testimony. So, and I've given a lot of live analysis internationally, locally, and a lot of media regarding this case and Sunny Balwani's case and several other cases. So again, please hit the like button. Please do subscribe to the channel if you want to join our chat. So this video, I have to say it, is for education information purposes. Simply my opinion, my analysis. So what's your analysis? Okay, so Elizabeth Holmes was convicted in January of 2021. I cannot believe I've been following this case this long. But you know, these cases take a while. She was convicted on those 4 counts. She was sentenced to 135 months in prison. Okay. She is appealing her conviction basically for 2 reasons. One, that the judge made a mistake. The court made a mistake on the evidence. In other words, the court should have let certain evidence in, but kept certain evidence out. The other reason she's appealing is because she's claiming that her due process rights and her confrontation rights of the Constitution, in other words, her constitutional rights were violated. So that's the 5th Amendment, the right to due process, and the 6th Amendment, the right to confront witnesses against you. Okay, so I have my notes because there's a lot. And again, this is just highlights. I'm just giving you the details. What do I think the outcome will be? Well, I'll tell you this. So far, this appeal, I think is, I think they've got some good points in here. So don't underestimate Elizabeth Holmes, okay? So if you've been following me, you understand what I meant by that statement, all right? And I'm sure there's going to be more surprises to come. All right, so let's go ahead and go through it. So was it an unjust conviction? Was the 135 months a severe sentence? Did the court flout the rules of evidence? In other words, ignore the rules of evidence or violate the rules of evidence? The key to this appeal is Elizabeth Holmes has to show the standard of review. For those of you lawyers and law students who are listening, the standard of review is Elizabeth Holmes has to show that there was prejudicial error, not harmless error, because that happens, you know, mistakes happen in trial, but it has to be prejudicial error. In other words, the error has to be so substantial that it affected the outcome, affected her convictions. So what are the reasons that Elizabeth Holmes is claiming there's prejudicial error or reversible error that would require the Court of Appeal to remand the case for a new trial? In other words, throw out her convictions, or in the alternative, she's asking for the Court of Appeal, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal, to remand the case for resentencing. So she either wants to be resentenced or she wants the convictions tossed and to get a new trial. All right, so let's go through what they're specifically claiming. And again, these are just the highlights. I have to look at my notes because I made a lot of them. You'd be impressed. All right, so just one second here. Before I get to that, let me just give you a little background here. The Court of Appeal generally defers to what the lower court does, to what the trial court does. In other words, the Court of Appeal doesn't want to get involved unless there's really prejudicial error or substantial rights, in this case, constitutional rights, were violated. But again, Elizabeth Holmes has to prove that it's prejudicial, not harmless error. All right. And appeals, as I've said all along, are difficult to win. But I think there might be some possibilities here, some strong possibilities. She may have a shot. And if she loses at the Court of Appeal, does she have the right to appeal anywhere else? Any guesses there? Any guesses? Does she have the right to appeal anywhere else? James Slick, England, starting soon. Did I not? Can you guys put something in the chat so I know you're there? Or am I just talking to the, put a little chat in the chat box to let me know you guys are there? Or hit the thumbs up. Can you guys hear me? All right. So if she loses, thank you. Thank you for the hitting the like button. And thank you for joining me. If she loses at the Court of Appeal, does she have the opportunity? No further appeal. Does she have the opportunity to appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States? Well, if it's a constitutional violation, she possibly has a right to appeal to the Supreme Court. Will the Supreme Court hear it? That's up to them. It's their discretion. I don't know. We'll have to see. And again, my analysis is just based on what Elizabeth Holmes is saying, what she's claiming. We haven't seen the government's response yet, the government's brief. Okay, so we don't know what the government's arguments are going to be or responses to what Elizabeth Holmes claims happened. Okay, so thanks again. Thanks for the thumbs up, everybody. All right, so let's go through. What are the errors that Elizabeth Holmes is claiming that happened in her trial? What are the errors? Now, again, she has to prove prejudicial error to get a reversed convictions or resentencing. Is a bit of a case of making his own homework? Isn't this a bit of a case of marking his own homework? Well, actually, no. It goes to the Court of Appeals. So it's a panel of 3 judges who are going to decide whether or not there were errors committed in the trial. In other words, was Elizabeth Holmes' constitutional rights violated? And or did the judge make a mistake? Did the trial court make a mistake in their rulings on the evidence? In other words, the judge may have made a mistake on keeping certain evidence out and letting certain evidence in, which ultimately impacted the outcome of the verdict. All right. Okay, good. Thank you, James. And be sure to subscribe, James. Okay, so here are the errors. Let me go through. I think I have 5 or 6 errors. And let me know if I'm talking too quickly. Number 1, Dr. Doss's testimony. If you remember Dr. Doss, he was the one that Elizabeth Holmes hired after the CMS, when the CMS was investigating. He was the last lab director. He was the one that came in and testified that he looked at the technology. He found that it wasn't working. He's the one that recommended to Elizabeth Holmes to void those tests, those, I think it was 50 to 60,000 blood tests. Okay, Dr. Doss, this Elizabeth Holmes is claiming, Dr. Doss should not have been allowed to testify as to what his opinion was regarding whether or not her technology worked. So they're claiming that that was an expert witness opinion, which Dr. Doss was not allowed to give, and that the prosecution did what they called an end run around the evidence code by claiming that Dr. Doss was a lay witness. Therefore, he was just talking about what he observed in his job, and he wasn't giving any scientific or specialized knowledge regarding the technology, which would make him an expert witness. So in other words, what they're claiming is that the court allowed Dr. Doss to testify as an expert when that expert witness testimony was not admissible. All right. So I hope that makes sense. And the other thing that they point out all along in several of these reasons to have the court reverse, for the Court of Appeal to reverse, is they're saying that Dr. Doss' investigation, and when he came into Theranos, all of that was in 2016, which is after the fact. These are after the alleged misrepresentations. Because if you look at the indictment, the events that the prosecution claimed and that Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty of relates to the years of 2010 to 2015. Therefore, anything that Dr. Doss said regarding the technology in 2016 is after the frauds occurred. Okay? So that is, that doesn't tell us what the technology was at the time that the frauds occurred, when the investors were defrauded or the patients were defrauded, although Elizabeth Holmes was acquitted on the patient counts. Okay, so second reason. Number one, Dr. Doss's testimony was expert witness. He shouldn't have been allowed to testify to whether or not the technology worked. Second reason was the CMS finding. The CMS report was in 2016. Again, after the fact of the alleged misrepresentations. It occurred later than the alleged misrepresentations. Elizabeth Holmes also claims that she wasn't able to cross-examine, good point here, to cross-examine the authors of that CMS report. And again, the CMS report made findings in 2016, which is after the allegations in the indictment, which were from 2010 to 2015. Interesting point. All right, third reason. The jury was allowed to hear testimony that the tests, 50 to 60,000 tests, were voided. And Elizabeth Holmes claims, number one, that was after the years of the fraud, right? Number two, it's irrelevant because it doesn't show that Elizabeth Holmes had knowledge of the technology not working when the tests were voided. Number three, it was too prejudicial. We're getting to that prejudicial error. It was too prejudicial because it could confuse the jury, because the jury could think that the technology didn't work. That's why they voided the tests, right? So again, the other point about the CMS report is that Elizabeth Holmes also pointed out on the CMS report findings that, again, that could confuse the jury because they would lean towards convicting her because she violated regulatory violations. Okay, so the regulatory violations that were found in the CMS report would confuse the jury to think, oh, well, she didn't, the technology wasn't working then and she knew it. All right. So let's go to the fourth reason. Fourth reason was Sunny Balwani's SEC testimony. Now, there was a separate investigation done by the Security and Exchange Commission on Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani. Sunny Balwani gave a deposition, and in that deposition, he admitted that he had sole responsibility for the financials in the financial models. Why is that important? It's important because Elizabeth Holmes claims that some of these investors were given the financial projections and some were not. Specifically, we have Alan Eisenman, Chris Lucas, and Brian Tolbert. Those three counts, Elizabeth Holmes, the jury came back hung. They were undecided. Those three investors were not given the financials. So therefore, Elizabeth Holmes is claiming that the other investors who were given the financials, and she was convicted on those counts, that the jury must have concluded that the financial projections mattered. Therefore, the fact that Sunny Balwani admitted that he had sole responsibility, that corroborated Elizabeth Holmes' testimony that she had no knowledge, she wasn't involved in financials. That was all Sunny Balwani's responsibility. Okay, I hope you're following me on that. Let me look at the note chat here. Thank you for subbing, James. All right, fungi. In other words, it's the same arguments. Didn't work the first. No, these are actually a little bit more specific arguments. Will she be jailed pending this appeal? Well, that's a good question. Elizabeth Holmes is set to surrender next week. April 27th. Unless she appeals the judge's denial of her motion for release pending appeal, her stay-at-home request. If she doesn't file an appeal, just like Balwani did, and appeal it to the Ninth Circuit, if she files that appeal, that'll stay her surrender date. If she doesn't file that appeal, she will be surrendering to prison on April 27th. Okay? Hi there, Hugo. Thank you for joining me. Okay, so where are we? All right, so Balwani's SEC testimony. Elizabeth Holmes is saying that because Balwani admitted that he had sole responsibility for the financials that were given to some of the investors, of which she was convicted on and he was convicted on, he's the one who's responsible. She didn't intentionally or knowingly misrepresent the financial situation of Theranos to anybody because she had no involvement. Sunny Balwani had sole responsibility. Yet the judge did not allow that testimony to come in to corroborate her defense, right? So let's see, what else? Let me get to the next reason. All right, now we're going to go to the constitutional violations that Elizabeth Holmes is claiming. She's claiming two particular constitutional rights that she claims were violated in the trial. The Fifth Amendment, let me see if I have it, and the Sixth Amendment. I'll read it to you because I think it's important, especially these days when there's much bigger frauds going on than Elizabeth Holmes, let me tell you. Or Sunny Balwani. All right, so the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution says the following. No person shall, and I'm just going to read the important parts, or the relevant parts. No person shall be held to answer, blah, blah, blah. All right, so no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. In other words, deprived of life, liberty, freedom. She has to go to prison, right? But she's entitled to have due process. And why does she claim due process? She claims that her due process rights were violated because Adam Rosendorf, Dr. Rosendorf, testified, and she was not allowed. Dr. Rosendorf, for those of you who popped on this channel, he was one of the lab directors. He's the one that talked to Elizabeth about the accuracy or the inaccuracy with the blood testing. He was the one that resigned because he was not comfortable with how the results were going, yet he did approve many of these tests. All right, so Elizabeth Holmes was not allowed to cross-examine Dr. Rosendorf in the trial regarding his subsequent employment with 3 different labs. And why that's important, according to Elizabeth Holmes, is because she was not allowed her right to confront. That's Sixth Amendment. I forgot to tell you about that. Hold on a second. But anyway, Rosendorf went on to work for Invitae, Ubiome, and Perkins-Elmer, 3 different labs. And in the Invitae lab where he worked, there was found to be systemic error. In the Ubio lab, Rosendorf admitted that on his resume because apparently he was fired. And regarding the Perkins-Elmer lab, there was investigations going on that found deficient lab practices. And so why that was relevant, why Elizabeth Holmes was not allowed to get into this to talk about what had happened at these other labs that had similar problems that was going on with Theranos, was relevant because it goes to Adam Rosendorf's competency, because all along she was claiming it wasn't due to the technology. There was no problem with the technology, right? That's what she values the most, that her technology works, okay? So nothing wrong with the technology. It was the people in the lab that were screwing it up. It was human error. It had nothing to do with the technology. So she wanted to point out in cross-examination the ability to confront a witness, which is your Sixth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, or constitutional right. She was not allowed to get into his bias, right? If these other labs are being investigated, maybe he's going to want to help out the government in his testimony. If if there are other problems going on in labs that he goes to, maybe it's Adam Rosendorf that's the problem. Maybe it's his competency that's the problem. But they were not allowed to get into that in cross-examination. It was very limited that they were allowed to talk about. So she's claiming that was a violation of her Sixth Amendment of the Constitution, which says, in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to be confronted with witnesses against him. So she's claiming she was not allowed to have a relevant or a proper cross-examination to point out to the jury the incompetence of Alan Rosendorf, his bias. He wanted to point the finger at her because he didn't want to point the finger at his mistakes at the other, allegedly mistakes at the other labs, right? Pointing the finger at Adam Rosendorf. He was pointing the finger at Elizabeth Holmes. All right. And also whether or not he's credible, right? The jury is instructed to evaluate the witness's credibility, their motive, their bias, potentially, right? She will most surely do a Balwani appeal against her surrender date. Yeah, I would think she is going to appeal her surrender date. All right, so let's talk about the sixth reason, the violation of the due process, again, Fifth Amendment, deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. That relates to the sentencing error. She's now claiming that the judge made a mistake in sentencing. All right, so one of her reasons is if the Court of Appeals doesn't want to reverse the convictions, she's asking for the Court of Appeal to send it back to the trial court to have the trial court resentence her. Just like, what was his name? Jeffrey Schilling from Enron. His case was sent back. Some of his convictions were reversed, and his case was sent back for resentencing. And then he worked out a deal with the prosecution, right? Got a lower sentence. Maybe that's what Elizabeth Holmes is going to be doing. Just kind of putting it out there. All right, so what's the sentencing error here? Elizabeth Holmes is claiming that there's a sentencing error because the judge made a mistake on the law. The judge applied the wrong standard of proof, is what Elizabeth Holmes is claiming. And again, these are all allegations, doesn't mean it's true. She's claiming that the judge made a mistake, that the judge applied the preponderance of evidence standard when the judge should have applied the clear and convincing standard. It's a higher standard of proof. And if the judge had applied a clear and convincing standard, then those enhancements, which gave Elizabeth Holmes more than 10 years, additional 10 years, those sentencing enhancements would have not been applied to Elizabeth Holmes. All right, so let me go through it with you. She's claiming that it should have been clear and convincing because the enhancements were extremely disproportionate to the crime that occurred. Basically, I'm paraphrasing, extremely disproportionate. Because what happened is, and there goes my notes. What happened is that in the sentencing guidelines, and if you go back to the very first video I did where I walk you through the sentencing guidelines, fraud starts at a level 7. All right. The judge tacked on an additional 10 years based on the amount of loss, right? The judge found there was $120 million in loss. So if you go down the sentencing table on the amount of loss, that gets to 108 months. So she went from level 7, which is 0 to 7 months. Judge added the amount of loss, which is 120 million, got to 108 months. And then the judge calculated how many victims there were. And if there are more than 10 victims, the judge can go down 2 more steps, which got her a sentence of 135 months. Okay, everyone got that? All right. So the 135 months Elizabeth Holmes is claiming is not should not have been applied because of the wrong standard of proof. And I have to look at my notes here. The loss amount alone added 10 years. And by the way, the count relating to the DeVos family, the RDV fund, that was a $99 million investment or a $99 million loss, which is the bulk, which was the bulk of the 144 million. If you calculate the amount in the indictment, it's approximately 144 million. But the judge did 120 million because they did an offset based on, I'll call it residual value of Theranos at the time of the frauds. But so the judge, the bulk of that 99 million, right, was the RDV fund. And that alone, just based on the amount of loss for those three investors where she was convicted, that gave her 10 years. And then adding the 10 victims, according to the sentencing guidelines, the judge has the discretion to add another 2 levels. And that's how he got to 135. All right, so why is she arguing? Not only did the judge apply the wrong standard of proof, she's claiming, but that the loss was incorrectly calculated because there was not a proper offset or a reduction in the loss amount for the 700 million valuation of the licensing opportunities and the value of the patents that Elizabeth Holmes holds. In other words, those values were not deducted and considered in the calculation of loss. And had they been, she wouldn't be looking at 135 months or 11 years, 3 months in prison. She also claims that the government did not prove that there was a causal, that she caused the loss, because several of these victims that the judge considered in the loss calculation, there was no evidence presented at trial. Very interesting argument. No evidence relating to 5 of the 10 victims that the judge considered in that calculation, which gave her an additional 2 steps because it was 10 or more victims. The judge can add 2 more steps, which is an additional 27 months. She's claiming that there was no evidence presented at trial of 5 of those 10 victims to show that she caused the loss. Specifically, victims Mendenhall TF, and I apologize, I'm mispronouncing, Kovacevic, PVP, LVG, and Rupert Murdoch. Those were 5 of the 10 victims that the judge considered in enhancing Elizabeth Holmes' sentence 2 more levels. For instance, Elizabeth Holmes says there was no statement made by Rupert Murdoch to show that he lost his $125 million investment in Theranos. And that was not evidence presented at trial. That was evidence presented at the sentencing. And that was part of the pre-sentence report, which is confidential. I don't have a copy of it. I don't know what was in it, but because they filed this appeal, I found this out. All right. So she's claiming there was no evidence of the loss presented at trial for 5 of 10 of these victims that the judge considered. It was based on what's called extra record statements. That means statements that were made after the trial, all right, as part of the sentencing phase. There was no testimony presented at trial of 5 of those 10 victims, of which she got an enhancement for. Another point that Elizabeth Holmes points out is those 5 victims, 5 of those 10 victims, the ones that I just talked about, were not subject to any cross-examination. In other words, Elizabeth Holmes wasn't able to ask them or test where the loss came from. Was she the cause of the loss? Did they invest based on representations? Because the core, according to Elizabeth Holmes, the core allegation of the government's case is that Elizabeth Holmes knowingly and intentionally misrepresented the capability of technology. Therefore, these investors invested, right? And because of that, they all suffered a loss. But she's claiming she was not allowed to cross-examine 5 of these 10 victims. 5 of these 10 victims did not testify in her trial. They didn't. And again, I'm just pointing out her position here. I'm not saying I agree with it. And that that testimony was not part of her trial, and she was not allowed to cross-examine them. She also points out that 2 of the 10 victims that gave her that enhancement, that additional 27 months, 2 of those 10 victims, specifically Black Diamond Ventures and I think it's Craig Hall or the Hall Group, she was acquitted on those counts. She was acquitted, and yet they're using that to say, if she was acquitted, then how can the government show that Elizabeth Holmes was the cause of this loss? But yet the judge considered those 2 victims as part of his calculation of the 10 total victims. I hope this is making sense. All right, let me look at the chat here. Probation recommended 9 years. Yes, the judge sentenced her to approximately, I think, 27 months than when probation recommended. Michele, can I ask you, don't you think that it's weird that it's almost 18 months? No, it's not weird. It takes a while. This process takes a while. It's because it's being followed by me and I'm posting these videos, and because it got a lot of media attention, that you're actually watching how a case plays out in real time. It seems like a long time, but a lot of the motions and the process that Elizabeth Holmes has followed, a lot of defendants do it. Okay, it's not just rich defendants. You have to remember, a lot of defendants have court-appointed public defenders or federal defenders, and they pursue a lot of these, file a motion for a new trial, the acquittal motion. They ask for motion, for release pending appeal. They file all, similar motions trying to keep evidence out, get evidence in. It's just taking a while. All right. Her sentencing was delayed because they're waiting for the outcome. Well, that's something I pointed out, Fungi, that I thought, the judge was going to, it was a co-conspirator case, right? So you don't want to sentence, you would want to sentence the co-defendant, the co-conspirator. In other words, Elizabeth Holmes was sentenced after Sunny Balwani's trial, because the judge has to consider, a lot of the, could be considered as far as for Elizabeth Holmes sentencing. All right. Then she got pregnant a second time, and the judge decided to give her a little extra more time. Well, to give her time for birth, and taxpayers do not need to pay for the birth. Well, pregnant women go to jail all the time. The judge, in his discretion, showed some compassion there, I guess. I don't know how you want to describe it, but allowed her, to have the birth of her child at home, for bonding of the children, all of that. And again, me, technically pregnancy does not weigh in on sentencing. The judge can consider, sentencing guidelines are not mandatory. They are discretionary. So this sentence is at the judge's discretion, which is why the Court of Appeal, usually there is, prejudicial error in sentencing, or the judge applied the wrong standard, should have applied a higher standard of proof, clear and convincing evidence that Elizabeth Holmes caused the loss of all of these 10 victims. Then, the Court of Appeal can review that. All right. So again, 5 of the 10 victims, they were not subject to cross-examination. They didn't testify at the trial, yet the court considered it to increase Elizabeth Holmes' sentence 27 months. 2 of the 10 victims, she was acquitted on those counts, which they're claiming should prove that she didn't cause the loss. And she, again, is seeking reversal of the convictions and resentencing. All right. So, what else do I want to tell you here? So before I get into the best shot I think she has, let me look at your questions here. Hang on a second. All right. So the questions that you send me, or the comments, let me get to those. So Blushing Foreigner, thank you very much for being a longtime subscriber. And by the way, I'll get all this, visual stuff worked out. I just, I shoot from the hip a lot of times. All right. So Blushing Foreigner said, thanks, Michele. Is this a kitchen sink appeal? No, I don't think it is. Will anything stick? Well, I think her constitutional violation, potential constitutional rights violated, in the sense that she was not allowed to cross-examine Rosendorf? Maybe. The other question about how the judge calculated the sentencing? Maybe. You know, if you're not allowed to cross-examine on loss by victims who didn't testify at the trial, yet statements based on interviews with potential victims, although the court can consider all kinds of, all victims, whether or not they were a charged count. But is that a violation of due process, right? Or her right to confront Adam Rosendorf? If the jury had known that Balwani had admitted sole responsibility of the financials, would that have changed their decision? Okay. So, Hugo, thank you for subscribing. Looking for ever more ridiculous excuses not to go to prison. They're not ridiculous excuses. These are actually valid points. Whether or not the Court of Appeal thinks it amounts to prejudicial error, that's a whole nother story. And again, the Court of Appeal is a panel of 3 judges that looks at the trial transcript, looks at the law, and decides whether or not the judge made a mistake on the evidentiary ruling, should have let certain evidence in, like Balwani's SEC testimony, should have kept certain evidence out, like Dr. Doss's opinion as to whether or not the technology worked, or whether the judge made a mistake on the law, applied the wrong standard of proof regarding regarding calculating the sentence. So, a windy old bird, thank you for subscribing. Let me see where are the notes here. You had a comment, amazing that, and I'm sorry I can't read. No, I don't have your full comment here. My apologies, but something about her wild stories of greatness. Yeah, but I watched the trial. I watched what the evidence came in. I wasn't really paying attention to what other people were saying. I was paying attention to what the evidence was presented at trial. Okay, so let's see. Aussie Girl said, these arguments sound a bit more compelling than others she's tried. I agree, except she still needs to get past the hurdle of the Pfizer logo. No, she's not. I mean, there's a lot of other evidence out there to support the conviction. But that doesn't mean the Court of Appeal can't toss these convictions. If they find that their constitutional rights were violated, or that they find that the judge made a mistake on the law or applied the wrong standard of proof, doesn't matter about the Pfizer logos, right? The Court of Appeal can remand it and send it back for a new trial or for resentencing. It seems bizarre that they put in the appeal before the Ninth Circuit. Well, they appealed the Ninth Circuit because they had a deadline to file their brief. Surely she's had enough time. Oh, I don't have the rest of it. My apologies. And your other comment was, I'm in the middle of reading the full appeal now. I'm up to about page 30 of 135. By the way, it's worth reading. Would a seasoned judge like Holmes had made such huge errors and risked the appeal? Look, this judge has been on the bench for many years as a district federal judge. Prior to that, he served as a Superior Court judge. Prior to that, he was a criminal defense attorney. Prior to that, he was a public defender. I'm sure he's well aware what the law says, and I'm sure he's not unsettled by having the Court of Appeal review his rulings. All right. But sometimes mistakes happen, and every defendant, including Elizabeth Holmes and Sonny Balwani, by the way, he filed his appeal too. Every defendant has a right to file an appeal of their convictions and of their sentencing, right? Every defendant has a right to do that. And defendants rarely win appeals. So Elizabeth Holmes has a pretty steep hill to climb to prove that there is prejudicial error and to prove that certain evidence should have come in or stayed out, or that her constitutional rights were violated. All right, let me see. I hope she enjoys her stay at the Gray Bar. I don't know what that is. I think that the judge shut the cross at Rosendorf down because he was not on. That was, yeah, fungi points out that the judge closed down the cross-examination of Rosendorf because he was not, that was not, those labs and what happened in those labs. And I'm sure this is what the prosecution is going to point out. What happened in subsequent labs that Rosendorf worked at have nothing to do with what happened at Holmes's. But maybe it has to do with his bias or his motive to lie. Because if he knew at the time he was testifying, Rosendorf knew, if Rosendorf knew at the time he was testifying that one of those labs was being investigated, which it was, or the founders of, I think, the Ubiome lab were actually indicted, maybe that is something the jury should have known about. Again, this is a call that the judge can make. Whether it arises to prejudicial, meaning it had some significant impact on the outcome, that's up for the Court of Appeal to decide. Yes, the judge gets, like every judge, gets their cases, their decisions appealed all the time. I did it, cases that I was involved in, both as a prosecutor and as a defense attorney, those were appealed too. That's part of the job. All right. It happens all the time. Joe Walters, love all of your coverage. Thank you, Joe. Thank you for supporting my channel. I so appreciate it. And again, if you want to contribute to me making these videos, or super chat me, I put a PayPal link in the chat box, and there's a link in the description box below the video. And at some point, I'll upgrade all my equipment when I have a moment and I have some wherewithal to do it. Okay. Love your coverage. Intellectually, I know she has a right to appeal these issues. However, emotionally, I find her behavior so outrageous, it's hard for me to just roll with it. Well, Elizabeth Holmes doesn't think she did anything wrong. She's always said she didn't know. To prove wire fraud, you have to show that the defendant intentionally, knowingly misrepresented. She's saying she didn't know. She was out there raising money. She didn't know what was going on in the lab, although you might want to look at the videos I've done and the text between Balwani and Holmes. It's pretty clear. He was telling her that the lab was an effing disaster zone. And as I said this a long time ago, this technology she created, she spent many years putting this together. She dropped out of Stanford. And are we to believe that she was hands off? She never checked in to see if her technology was working. She was not tweaking it, creating all these other patents. Come on. That's what I would have said. All right. But I didn't, it wasn't my case. She spent so many years developing this. And what's her value proposition here? What is she invested in? Her vested interest is not to have the technology shown to not work all the time. In her case, it wasn't about the technology. It was about what was going on in the labs. It's because, allegedly Rosendorf is incompetent. Incompetent lab employees. The jury didn't believe it. Okay? The jury convicted her of defrauding investors, conspiring with Balwani, and defrauding the 3 individual investors. Okay? Jose, anyone know if Billy, I don't know. He left the country for a while. Well, that point about her getting a ticket, and I pointed this out before. Was she planning on fleeing, or was she so confident that she was not going to be convicted? That's why she bought that plane ticket to Mexico to go to some wedding. I think it was to Mexico or wherever. And the judge pointed out that was a bold move. I think that was very nice of the judge. I might have worded it a little differently. Okay, Sonny is supposed to surrender to prison today. Anyway, well, if Sonny Balwani is going to be spending his time in prison pending appeal. So the next step is whether or not Elizabeth Holmes is going to be spending time in prison pending appeal, awaiting the court's decision. If she doesn't appeal the denial by the trial court of her right to stay at home, basically, her motion for release pending appeal, if she doesn't appeal that by the 27th, she surrenders on the 27th. Okay, and I think it's Bryan, Texas, but again, it's up to the Bureau of Prisons to decide. I think the judge recommended Bryan, Texas, but it's the Bureau of Prison who decides where Elizabeth Holmes surrenders to prison. All right. Any other questions? Let me see if I have any other comments here. So do you remember in that comment, and I encourage you to go to the community page and read what I'm posting, because I don't always have time to do the videos. Go to that comment. I think it was about 8 days ago that I posted where I gave you a hint. And the hint was related to what words did the judge use when he denied I think it was the motion for release. No, let me see which one. I can't remember which it was, but it was the language regarding the misrepresentations made by Elizabeth Holmes. And if you look at that paragraph that I cited, where the court said that basically Elizabeth Holmes is claiming that the judge said that there were no rulings directly pertaining to the investor counts regarding, it was her motion, it was the judge's ruling on her motion for a new trial. And Elizabeth Holmes claimed that no, that's a mistake by the judge, because actually one of the allegations in the indictment was that she misrepresented the capability of the technology. And when the court went on to say that the misrepresentations don't turn on whether the technology worked, because there were other misrepresentations she made, Elizabeth Holmes is claiming, but the central or the core allegation, and I think this is interesting, the central or the core allegation of this case is whether or not the technology worked, right? Because if the technology didn't work, why are they investing? The representation is the technology worked. Why would you be investing in a company based on what their financials were? Again, this is just an argument I'm making. All right, let me back up here. In the indictment, there are several allegations that the government alleged that Elizabeth Holmes made as misrepresentations. One of them is misrepresenting the capability of technology. Another one is misrepresenting the current and future revenues of Theranos. Third was misrepresenting that they were using their own analyzers when they were using third-party analyzers. Another misrepresentation that was alleged in the indictment was that Elizabeth Holmes was talking about that they had an ongoing relationship with Walgreens when in fact it stalled out, or that they had a relationship with the Department of Defense when the government, I think in the trial, was that whether or not the analyzers were used in the field. And they also pointed out another allegation was whether pharmaceutical companies validated the technology. All of those allegations, each one was a misrepresentation, which the court is saying, even if you don't look at just the misrepresentation regarding the capability of the technology, the other misrepresentations would support a conviction of fraud. But Elizabeth Holmes is claiming, no. The core issue is whether or not the technology worked, right? This innovative technology, fast, accurate, and reliable blood testing. You waltz into Walgreens, so one of the wellness center, you get a prick on your finger. The blood, is then analyzed, and a bunch of different assays are done. A bunch of different tests are done. They're claiming that was a core issue. A central issue is whether or not the technology worked. And I would say that might have some traction, because why are you investing in a company? Are you investing because of the relationship with the DoD, or because the pharmaceuticals validated the technology, or because they were using their own analyzers. Isn't the underlying question whether or not the technology worked? I don't know. I don't know if it's an argument that's gonna work or not, but it's an interesting one. And this appeal is worth reading. It might be good for any of those of you insomniacs, but the 132 pages is worth reading because there are some interesting arguments that are being made. All right. Let me look at the chat here. With all of the board members with political and military careers, obtaining government contracts might have been a long-range goal. Yeah, I mean, isn't that what's going on now? Seems, yeah. I mean, some people say she traded on the reputation of the board. She had several Secretary of State, military leaders on her board, right? Which maybe gave credibility to Theranos, maybe was able to get some of the government contracts, maybe convinced some, or gave some assurance to other investors, maybe. Elizabeth Holmes can't attribute misleading revenue projections to CEO. Well, the defense is claiming that because they, in the trial, there was hundreds of millions of dollars that in Theranos accounting, they characterize as deferred revenue. So they're saying it's still counted as revenue, okay? So she wasn't misleading the investors. But, the jury of 12 decided to convict her on 4 of 11 counts, which in her appeal brief, they claim that that's classic proof, or let me cite it to you particularly. It's classic, let me get it right. It's a classic indicator of prejudice because the jury convicted her of 4 of 11 counts. I don't know if I agree with that, but prejudicial error, which is the test, which is what the Court of Appeal has to find in order to reverse her convictions or to get her resentenced. Prejudicial error is a high standard to meet. All right. And they say follow me on this. If the CMS report wasn't introduced into trial, if Dr. Doss was not allowed to give that opinion to say the technology didn't work, if the voided test, if the jury didn't know about the voided test, all of that, which took place in 2016 after the investors invested in Theranos after the fraud, all of that evidence, the 3 pieces of evidence, Dr. Doss, CMS finding and voiding results, had the jury not known about that, they probably would not have convicted Elizabeth Holmes. I think that's what the defense is trying to argue here. Whether or not it works or not, we'll find out. So the appeal process, so the next thing that's going to happen is the government has to file their brief in response to all of the stuff that I've covered, all of the claims that Elizabeth Holmes is making, her constitutional rights were violated. The judge, messed up on evidentiary rulings, shouldn't have let this stuff in. They should have been able to point the finger at Balwani. They should have been able to cross-examine Rosendorf. They should have been able to cross-examine 5 of those 10 victims, investor victims, that the judge used to enhance. The judge blew it on the calculation, whatever it is they're saying. The Court of Appeal, is going to take a look at the transcript, look at how the judge ruled, look at what the law says, and make a determination. That could take anywhere from 18 months to 2 years, or longer, depending on the caseload, or shorter, depending on the caseload. Meanwhile, Balwani is going to be sitting in prison, and it looks like at this point, unless she appeals it, Elizabeth Holmes will be in prison awaiting the decision. And at the Court of Appeal, there's an opportunity, if the Court of Appeal decides, if the panel of 3 judges decides to grant oral arguments, then the attorneys representing the government and Elizabeth Holmes will then have an opportunity, not very long, it's usually 15 minutes, maybe a little longer, to answer some questions the Court of Appeals may have. if the court allows them oral arguments. They don't have to give an oral arguments. They can just make their decision based on the briefs, filed by each side. So Elizabeth's filed her brief. The government is going to file their brief next. Then Elizabeth Holmes has an opportunity to file a reply brief. The Court of Appeal will look at all of that, make a determination. They could give oral arguments, an opportunity for oral arguments, or they could just give a written decision. At some point, they'll issue a written decision, all right? And the decision will decide whether or not they will remand the case for resentencing, or if they're going to remand it for a new trial. In other words, toss the convictions and toss the sentencing. All right. As I said, appeals are very difficult to win, but there are some interesting arguments here, and I'm going to be very curious to see what the government says in response, right? And by the way, and I've pointed this out in my comments, I kind of gave you guys the heads up on this. When a defendant alleges constitutional violations, that is something that the Supreme Court will consider as a constitutional question, or if there's a constitutional violation. So that gives Elizabeth Holmes possibly an opportunity to appeal, if she loses at the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal, to appeal with the Supreme Court of the United States. Okay? You have to think about, who is the defendant here, right? And, pursuing all avenues. And when someone believes that they did nothing wrong, they didn't intentionally or knowingly defraud anyone, then they're going to pursue it as far as they can. And Elizabeth Holmes, in my opinion, you always got to know who's in front of you. Elizabeth Holmes, in my opinion, she's a fighter and she's not going to give up here. Okay? Like any defendant, she's going to test the evidence, test the rulings, get a so-called second opinion from the Court of Appeals, and maybe a third opinion from the Supreme Court of the United States, which is difficult to have a writ to the Supreme Court, whether or not they hear it or not. That's a tough one. All right. Let me look at the chat here. According to Holmes' defense team, the judge shouldn't have been in. No, they're not saying that. They're just saying that, sometimes, and I've had it in trial, I've done a lot of trials. Sometimes judges make a mistake, and I'm not saying this judge made a mistake, but it's interesting arguments. All right. I can't really say that at this point. I got to see what the government has to say. But I was in the courtroom. I'm sure she will take it all the way top. Yep. Come on, Michele. What do you think? Will she be jailed during her appeal? Well, James, she's going to surrender to prison on the 27th unless she appeals, and that'll probably be in the next couple days here. Next week, and if she did what Balwani did, they wait till the very last minute. Then they appeal the denial of their basically stay-at-home request pending appeal. They appeal it with the Ninth Circuit. Now, these are separate appeals. One, the appeal that I've been talking about, it's appealing her convictions in the sentence. The other appeal would be appealing her denial to basically stay at home, or motion for release pending appeal. If she files that appeal by the 27th, that automatically triggers a stay to give the Court of Appeal an opportunity to look at whether or not the judge made the right decision in denying the motion for release pending appeal, which they already upheld this judge's decision. He was the same judge in the Sunny Balwani case. I know it's different cases, but they already upheld the judge's denial of that request. So I think if she files this appeal to the Ninth Circuit on the denial of the stay-at-home request, as I've said all along, I think it'll be denied. It might take 3 weeks, 4 weeks for the judge, for the Court of Appeal to give their decision upholding what the trial court's denial is. So it may stay her surrender date 3 or 4 weeks or however long. And at that point, she can do what Balwani did. She can come back to the trial court and ask the judge, can I have additional time to get my affairs in order? And just like the judge did with Balwani, the judge may grant her request for, a couple days, a week, or whatever. So that's why I'm kind of guessing. If it goes that way, it looks like it could be an actual June or July surrender date for Elizabeth Holmes. We don't know, but as I have said, it's never a dull moment in this case. And, I wouldn't be surprised if there could be other things that could happen between now and then. And we'll have to see. All right, we'll have to see what happens. But I think at this point, based on this 132-page appeal by Elizabeth Holmes, I think there are some arguments in there that could get her some traction. The sentencing argument, whether the correct standard of proof was applied, we'll have to see. The judge applied the preponderance of evidence because one of the counts was conspiracy. But the defense is saying, no, judge, should have been a clear convincing, because there's such a, what is the word again? This phrase, and an incredible amount of, let me get my notes. I got to use the right phrasing here. The enhancements were extremely disproportionate. Okay, she has no criminal record. I haven't seen the pre-sentence report, but assuming no criminal record, I don't think she has one. She should have got, according to the defense, 0 to 7 months. But 0 to 7 months, they've always asked for her not to serve any time, to basically stay at home confinement, home detention. But the thing is, the 0 to 7 months doesn't take into account the amount of loss. And once you start calculating the amount of loss, that's what takes her down to 135 months with the additional victims. But they are claiming, Elizabeth Holmes is claiming, no, you forgot to offset the loss by the $700 million in licensing opportunities or the value of my patents. Therefore, the net is 0. So I should get 0 to 7 months. We'll have to see what the Court of Appeal does. All right, let me see if there's any other notes I have. Any other questions you guys have before I conclude here? Okay, any other questions? Anybody? All right, Richard Strong, back to Rosendorf. He had a succession of jobs. Surely every one of them would have gone through. Yeah, Richard, so what they're claiming is the CV, his resume, he did not put on his resume that he worked for Ubiome Lab, which the defense wanted to point that out to the jury, to say the reason he didn't put that on his resume is because apparently he was fired from that job. And therefore the jury should know that, because if Elizabeth Holmes' defense is saying that it's not a technology issue, the problem was with the people in the lab, the competency. And if Rosendorf was fired, then maybe he was incompetent. Maybe that's what they were trying to argue. All right, any other questions? Anna's Band, thank you for joining us. I don't think it matters whether the technology work. Why does matter is that Holmes and Theranos weren't able to make it work. Therefore, yes, and therefore fraud is an appropriate charge. Well, in his band, if you look at the indictment, and you can go to the video I did the indictment where I walked you through it, there were several allegations, several misrepresentations that the prosecution alleges. One of those was whether or not the technology worked. The other allegations were, did they have revenue? Did they use third-party devices, or were they using their own analyzer? Did they have a relationship, working with DOD or Walgreens? Those are all separate misrepresentations, which the court pointed out in one of their decisions, which I posted on the community page. So scroll down and look at that. And that's where I gave you the hint. The court said they're not looking at just the misrepresentation regarding the technology working. They're looking at all the other misrepresentations, using third-party devices, which they didn't tell some of the investors. They said that their revenues, which were questionable, all of that could have amounted to misrepresentations. Therefore, the fraud conviction was the right outcome. Okay. So, but what the defense is arguing is that no, you can't. That's the central allegation. That's the core of the case, is whether or not the technology worked. And I would argue, well, why are they investing? Are they just investing based on based on those other alleged, those other misrepresentations? Or were they investing based on innovative technology that was going to change the healthcare industry, if that's what Elizabeth Holmes wanted to do, right? She was here to change the health, to be an innovative leader, Steve Jobs type, to change the healthcare industry. Or was it fraud? The jury found that it was all fraud. Okay, that they found her guilty on 4 counts. They acquitted her on the patient counts. The jury hung on several of the investor counts, right? So if they hung on those investor counts, then how can that be calculated? Those investors be calculated in the loss. Doesn't that show that she didn't cause it? That's what the defense is arguing. Okay. A lot of it, I don't want to restate what I've already stated, but you can go ahead and look at the video. I encourage you to read the appeal. It's good to know this stuff anyway. I'm the geek. I like following all this stuff. And it gives me an opportunity to share all my mileage and all my experience, and to start, to encourage you guys to analyze this stuff, right? This is a day where these times, we need to be analyzing information that we're given. We're to do our own research, right? And not, just because someone says it doesn't mean it's true. And just because opinions are not fact, right? So, do your own research. Okay, anything else before I conclude? Any other questions? So I want to say thank you to all of you who subscribe to my channel. Keep it growing. And thanks to all of you who contribute to me making these videos. I really appreciate it. Thank you to those of you who've reached out to help me with the visuals, I call them. I'll get to you. And thank you to all of those of you who joined us. You're welcome to join our analyzer community. We've got some pretty keen insight here, some great questions that you guys have asked. Thank you very much for your questions. Thank you for your comments. And thank you for supporting Michele's analysis, supporting my channel, our channel. And James, thank you. Thank you very much. And I hope this analysis, there's a lot in that 132 pages, but I tried to break it down as best I could. Okay. And again, this is just my opinion, my analysis. And I would love to, post some comments here. What do you guys think? Thanks for your analysis. Thank you, James. Jose, you're the best. Thank you. Fungi, he should be surrendering today. Thank you, Fungi, for the update. I'm expecting to pull something to avoid going. Well, you guys are like totally suspicious. If there are paths that they can take, then their attorneys should be following them, right? 20 minutes for, he surrenders in 20 minutes. Well, thank you, Jose, for that point. So interesting. He's surrendering on the day that I'm analyzing her appeal. And Sonny Balwani has filed his appeal. I haven't seen it yet. It's his argument. It's a different trial. But I'm sure a lot of his arguments, I'm sure he's going to be claiming prejudicial error. Judge made the wrong call on some, evidentiary rulings. These are just common points, common claims that defendants make in appeals. Okay, Diane, thank you. Hello there, Diane. Okay, anything else? Anything else? Should I let you guys go? Any other last minute questions? All right. So thanks again for joining me. Thanks for subscribing and supporting my channel. Please do subscribe to support my work. If you want to contribute to me making these videos, I put a PayPal link. If you want to super chat me, I put a PayPal link in the description box below the video. I want to thank all of you who've continued to support this channel. I really appreciate it. Thank you for all your wonderful comments, your great analysis, your very keen insight. Many of you have provided over the last, what have I been doing this, a year or so. And I hope these videos have been helpful to you. I hope my so-called translations have been helpful. And thanks again to all of you, and have a good week. And stay tuned, because you never know. It's never a dull moment in Theranos world. Thanks again for watching, and thanks for joining me for this live.